Good afternoon. This is Frank Gaffney. I apologize that I am in Washington, D.C. instead of with you and Tyler. I had every intention of being there, but could not get on the plane last night. A series of misadventures, but I'm appreciative to you all for allowing me to participate in this fashion. I would like to go through with you fairly quickly a series of slides that I hope will illuminate a problem that I'm particularly concerned about, and I suspect many of you are as well, namely the sorts of challenges that we're facing at the moment in the world more broadly, but also here in the United States, including in Texas. And so the focus of this presentation is, I hope, going to be very directly relevant to you there in the great state of Texas, but also to you as citizens of our country at a moment when, as I'll show you in a second, there are a lot of things that are seriously wrong. And one of the troubles is that we're not quite clear why, many of us, and I want to see what I can do to help, as I say, do some dot connecting. So if we can go to the first slide, I'm going to show you basically a series of these that'll just, I hope, facilitate, you know, the sorts of dots that we need to do some connecting on. This is, of course, a photo of three individuals who have led Egypt in recent days, including the President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The question that I think a lot of us have had is, why did the United States government under Barack Obama contribute to, facilitate, in some cases one might say indeed enable, the overthrow of a guy who, with all of his imperfections, was nonetheless a fairly reliable ally of the United States, Hosni Mubarak, in favor of a guy who runs an organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, or was running as a president of Egypt on behalf of the political party of the Muslim Brotherhood. And even today, after he was removed from power by the Egyptian people overwhelmingly, we find the Obama administration diffident, shall we say, not actually hostile to the al-Sisi presidency, and a much, much friendlier group of people who are now in power. So that's one dot. During the Morsi regime, of course, next slide if I may, you had evidence of how virulently anti-American it was by the fact that it allowed the U.S. embassy in Cairo to be attacked on September 11th, 2012. If we go to the next slide, up the coast, meanwhile, Islamists who we had recently helped come to power were certainly positions of greater influence after helping them overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, attacked the U.S. Special Mission Compound, as it was called, in Benghazi. And that resulted in, of course, the murder of our ambassador there, Chris Stevens, shown in this photograph, and 3 other Americans. A subject of now congressional inquiry with a select committee in the House of Representatives, finally. Interestingly enough, next slide, the following day, the president took to the Rose Garden and with Hillary Clinton at his side announced that what this was all about, this bloodletting in Benghazi, was a video that had prompted a mob that was demonstrating outside of this facility to go wild. At the time, the president knew that wasn't true, but he nonetheless said it. And in the next slide, we have him compounding the damage 2 weeks later at the United Nations, making a statement to the effect, quote, "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam," unquote. Again, kind of picking up on the theme that it was the video's fault, and frankly, on the idea that we mustn't do things that offend Muslims. So a couple more dots there that I wanted to bring to your attention. Next slide. We have here a photograph of the kind of people that we have been supporting in Syria among Islamist elements, or at least groups that have sworn their loyalty to a sort of umbrella front known as the Al-Nusra Front, executing in cold blood their recently conquered adversaries. We have also, of course, of late had another entrant in this mix, a group that apparently, by some reports at least, we've also been training, called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham. It's been part of the Al-Nusra Front. It broke away from it. There's some rivalry between them. But the point is that we've been helping Islamists in Syria in their opposition to Bashar Assad's regime. Next slide. I think you're all familiar with the gang on top of this set of photographs. These are the 5 Taliban, another group of Islamists, senior officials and military leaders who President Obama turned loose in exchange for Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who had been taken prisoner several years ago. The guys on the bottom, you may or may not recognize. I think you certainly get who the guy on the left is. The point of this is to display roughly the kind of stature that these folks have in Afghanistan relative to our own senior leaders. You have a governor, 2 governors actually, Governor of Texas, Governor of Pennsylvania. You have a former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a former senior White House communications officer, and the Army Chief of Staff. These are, in short, not just, your average run-of-the-mill jihadists who were detained in Gitmo. These are people of the first magnitude. Releasing them, even with a nominal house arrest in Qatar, is to have greatly enhanced the warfighting capabilities of the Taliban at a time when we are still engaged in conflict with them. Next slide, please. This is a somewhat arcane point, but I think its importance is going to become obvious in the course of the presentation. Back in February, the Obama administration announced that henceforth, just because you had engaged in limited material support for terrorism, would not preclude you from being able to come to the United States and gain refugee status. This is of grave concern at a moment when I think a lot of people who have been involved with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and are fearful of being punished there are looking for asylum, and evidently the Obama administration has in mind having them come here. Next slide, and I'll go through these rather quickly, but we had the administration releasing some 36,000 criminal illegal aliens. I heard you talking before I joined you about the problem with the invasion taking place across the border right now. Well, these are people who are already here, who were known to be criminal aliens, who were convicted in U.S. courts of some kind of criminal activity. They've been simply turned loose. Next slide. The administration has also created, having just been through the airport security exercise, this is particularly close to home, it's a kind of TSA pre-program, a fast-tracking for Muslims that it has engaged in what they call outreach with, even though they have had very dubious associations with the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations. Lastly, the third slide there in that series, the administration has ordered the elimination from its databases, specifically the Immigration and Customs Enforcement watch list, of information about some of these Muslim Brotherhood-tied travelers. So even if it were not the case that we were fast-tracking their arrival in this country, you would be hard-pressed if you were one of the ICE officers to evaluate what a danger they represented to admit to the country, because the information about their behavior and their conduct and their practices has been deleted from the files. Next slide. The Palestinian front of what I think of as the war for the free world is much in the news at the moment, as you know. Recently, the guy on the left, the ostensible good guy in the Palestinian community, Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas, has made common cause with the, at least heretofore, bad guy, Hamas leader Khalid Mashal, despite the fact that there are existing statutory prohibitions on the U.S. government having anything to do with Hamas. We are now sending funds to them. In fact, most recently, as you'll see in the next slide, we have actually sent about $47 million under the guise of humanitarian assistance from taxpayers to Khalid Mashal's Hamas as we're trying to broker, in the person of Secretary Kerry, a ceasefire on the Gaza front at the moment. That ceasefire, by the way, I think it was the administration's intention to accelerate Israel's acceptance of it by basically closing down traffic into and out of the main international airport of Israel, Ben Gurion. Fortunately, your own Senator Ted Cruz injected himself and asked some hard questions and said until he got satisfactory answers about whose idea it was to shut down Ben Gurion, he was not going to let any more State Department appointments be processed by the Senate. And that apparently concentrated the mind of the State Department, and they decided that people could fly in and out of Ben Gurion after all. Next slide, please. These slides, just to give you sort of a sense, and I suspect many of them have been things you've been thinking about or at least somewhat aware of, as evidence that, you know, something's not right here. The question, next slide, is, well, what is it? And the next slide suggests that, as I mentioned at the outset, we're not going to know unless we can find a way to connect these various dots rather than address them as kind of, you know, individual and unrelated issues. Next slide. I have here what I call a dot connector. This is a book, and I think we have some copies of it there for at least some of you. Again, I'm so sorry that I'm not there to sign them myself, and hope that we can get you more of them if you'd like. There's an online free downloadable version of this available if you don't want to spend the money on it, but would nonetheless like to get the book. The pictures on the left are 19 individuals who are the co-authors of this book entitled Sharia, the Threat to America. In effort to provide, as I say, sort of an insight into the connective tissue between these kinds of issues, problems, developments, and policy challenges that we face. If books aren't your thing, next slide, we have a course available, also online, also for free, that is a 10-part, it's roughly 8 hours long, video-based sort of presentation that we put together to try to, again, help explain what it is we're up against and why. And I commend that to you. I'm going to give you sort of the highlights of both the book and this course in the next couple of minutes. So let me go to the next slide, please. Sharia is obviously featured prominently in both the course and the book. Let me help define what the term means. It is in Arabic, literally, the same word is used for the path, or by some accounts, the path to the water. It's meant to describe the way that Muslims are to proceed. Not all Muslims, and I want to emphasize this as strongly as I can, not all Muslims, certainly not in this country and not in other parts of the world, practice their faith in line with what Sharia dictates. And I will tell you that I think those who don't are not, at least for the moment, are not threats to our country. The problem is those that do adhere to Sharia actually are and need to be regarded as such. Next slide. This is a somewhat subjective judgment, but I think it's fair to say that roughly 10% of the body of what is thought of as Islamic law, or Sharia, involves the prescribed practices of the religion itself. You know, how many times you pray, in what way, in what direction, what you wash, what you eat, what you don't, and the like. The problem is not so much with that as it is with what's described in the next slide, which is the other characteristics of this 90% of Sharia. Notably that it is a very comprehensive program. It is meant to govern all aspects of Muslims' lives and affairs, and it is of a totalitarian character. And people say Islamic law, it's no more than just law. It's really a political and military program as well as a legal one. Next slide, I'll just give you some of the highlights of what this means in practice. This poor chap is being flogged for having violated some tenet of Sharia, probably petty thievery. He's getting off light because other prescribed punishments involve amputations of various things. Next slide. This young lady, I'm sorry about the ghoulishness of this picture, but it appeared on the cover of Time magazine, so I figure we all better be able to accept it. You see some other things having been amputated. It's part of mutilating women, which is very much consistent with, if not actually obligatory, under Sharia's, well, misogynistic is the fancy term for it, but women-hating approach. It is obviously very much anti-constitutional. And next slide, and this is really the particularly worrying thing. The Sharia doctrine obliges its adherents to try to impose it worldwide. Fundamentally supremacist in character, it is something that is supposed to be inflicted upon Muslims, all Muslims, moderate and otherwise, as well as the true believers, and non-Muslims alike. Next slide. If I leave you really with one thought, this is the one I hope it might be. Sharia fundamentally is a problem because it is about power, not so much about faith. The good news, as we'll discuss, is that means that we can do something about it. If it's about faith, well, as you know, under our Constitution, faith means that it's to be respected. It's to be practiced in accordance with our freedom of religion. And there isn't a whole lot we can do about it. If it is about power, if it is basically about overthrowing the government and Constitution of the United States, well, that's sedition. That's illegal. We have ways of dealing with that. So that's why this is such a central tenet of my presentation. The next slide, please, is a feature of what you sometimes hear from Muslims if you get into this kind of discussion with them. Some will tell you that you don't really have anything to worry about because Sharia is actually completely consistent with the Constitution of the United States. In my experience, there are two possibilities when you find yourself hearing that from somebody of the Muslim persuasion. One is that they literally are ignorant of the nature of Sharia, have no idea what it entails, what it requires. More likely, if you're hearing it from somebody, particularly a person who is described as a leader of the Muslim faith in this country, they know exactly what they're talking about. And they know what they're telling you, that Sharia is consistent with the Constitution, is untrue. They're engaging in a practice that, again, is not just permissible under Sharia and its practice, but it's actually obligatory. You must lie for the faith, a practice known as taqiyya. Next slide. The preeminent practitioners of this Sharia supremacist program in the world today, I believe, are the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is important in a number of respects, not least that it is the grandfather of basically all of the other Islamist entities in the world today, many of whom engage in violence to achieve the goal of imposing Sharia worldwide. But next slide, that's the very explicit stated purpose and objective of the Muslim Brotherhood as well, to achieve Sharia's triumph. And also to establish something we've been hearing a bit about it lately out of Iraq called the Caliphate, to rule according to Sharia globally. Well, next slide. If you think about it, that is, those two goals, I should say, are exactly the same as those of people like the folks photographed in this picture. On the right, the late and unlamented bin Laden, founder of Al-Qaeda, and on the left, his successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the now leader of Al-Qaeda. The only difference between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, not about the goals, but about the tactics for achieving them. And as I'll discuss, even there, it is not always black and white. But Al-Qaeda believes basically that they can achieve their goal of destroying, enemies of Islam, forcing them to submit through violent means, which is the preferred technique as Muhammad's life demonstrated, he being the perfect Muslim, according to adherent to the faith. But for the Muslim Brotherhood, they've got a slightly more nuanced line. They're of the view that if you are going to have a violent approach, that's all well and good. They don't object to it. It's just they want to see it used where it will be practical and effective. If they're not strong enough, the Brotherhood's doctrine is then use other techniques to achieve the same ends. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute, but I just want to make clear that whether you're talking about the folks in Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or the Islamic State or Jamaat al-Fuqra or Jamaat Islamiyya or the Tablighi Jamaat, any number of these entities, they all have the same goal of establishing Sharia worldwide and having a caliphate or some kind of theocratic government. The Shias have the same basic program. They call them something other than caliphates and caliphs, but the basic idea is the same. So next slide. Fortunately, we had breakthrough of great importance back in 2004 on a major artery not too far from where I live, the Chesapeake Bridge. As you can see here in this photograph of it, a beautiful expanse, and not infrequently when people get up on the apex and they're looking out at that marvelous seascape, they decide they want to take a picture. Well, the guy on the left, on the right, who was at the time driving a vehicle going across the Bay Bridge, had in the passenger seat his wife. And Ismail El-Barassa and his wife were taking photographs all right, but an alert Maryland Transportation Authority police officer observed that they were not taking pictures of the scenery, they were taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge. And the police officer thought wisely that that didn't look right, so he pulled them over and ran their IDs and established that El-Barassa was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago for fundraising for a terrorist organization I've mentioned that's much in the news at the moment, Hamas. And that proved to be, as I say, a very providential discovery. The FBI was able to obtain and execute a search warrant on the El Barraza home in a suburb of Washington, D.C., again, not far from where I am, called Annandale, Virginia. And they went top to bottom, and below the bottom, they discovered a secret subbasement in which they found 80 banker boxes worth of documents that constituted the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. One of the documents that was found, next slide, is the one that we've republished, and again, I think we may have some copies, I hope we do, of this for you there. It's called an explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal of the group in North America. And it was published in 1991, not for our consumption. It was produced for the mothership back in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood's home headquarters. And it was basically a report on how things were going in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood's objectives and operations in the United States. If I could go to the next slide. This is the mission statement that's kind of at the core of what amounts to the strategic plan that's laid out in this explanatory memorandum. And it reads, as you can see there on the screen, it's a civilization jihadist process. And that's a key word, civilization jihad, whose objective is eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, for the purpose of achieving, with the help of their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, this goal and the triumph of God's religion, namely Islam, over all other religions. I don't know about you, but that doesn't strike me as all that friendly. In fact, evidence of a pretty ominous purpose, and sets the stage for what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. Before I turn to that, let me just say there was one other helpful feature of this memorandum. The whole thing was very instructive, actually. It really is a kind of playbook for how these guys are trying to operate in our country, and have since 1963. There was at the back end of it an attachment under the heading, Our Organizations and Organizations of Our Friends. You had this, I hope you've turned to the next slide, you had this list of 29 organizations. Now this is again 1991, so it was many years ago, and the number of groups that would be on this list today is several times, probably an order of magnitude more than this. But even today, these groups remain among the most prominent Muslim American organizations in the United States. Now note, I said Muslim American organizations. They're Muslim Brotherhood front groups, to be sure, but when people say, whether it's the President of the United States or State Department, Defense Department, other leaders of our government, that they're talking to or reaching out to leaders of the Muslim American community, typically they're talking about people who are associated with one or more of these groups, all of which are by the Muslim Brotherhood's own strategic plan identified as our organizations and organizations of our friends. Next slide. What is civilization jihad? Well, I think you can describe it as a full frontal assault on every civil society and governing institution in the United States. As I say, it started in 1963 when the Muslim Students Association, the second on that list, was founded. It now has some 500 chapters on American campuses. And as you see there on the fourth bullet, one of the things that they're very big on, these Muslim Brotherhood civilization jihadists, is using our educational institutions to advance their agenda. Recruiting, proselytizing, indoctrinating, training, some call it radicalizing, whatever term you wish to use, but it's the process of incubating new recruits for the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's being done on a lot of campuses across this country. You'll see as well some of the other hallmarks of this. Interfaith dialogue. I know we were all in church there, and many churches, I'm sure not the one you're in, but many churches around the United States, many synagogues and other faith communities have been induced over the years to engage in what's been called alternately interfaith dialogue and bridge building between faith communities, the basic purpose of which is to help shield the Muslim Brotherhood and its operations in this country from assault by law enforcement, by professing and having other, clerics attest to the fact that these are people of faith. It goes back to that central message that I wanted to leave with you. If this is about faith, and you have rabbis, and you have priests, and you have pastors and others attesting to this as being about faith, well, you give people who are actually engaged in sedition a great deal of running room to pursue their objectives. So interfaith dialogue, I think, is one of the most insidious of these civilization jihadist techniques. And I'll just make one further slight digression. It's important for you to understand. One of the preeminent Muslim Brotherhood ideologues of all time is a fellow by the name of Sayyid Qutb. And Sayyid Qutb wrote a very influential book called Milestones that had, among other passages, a reference to this, this business of bridge building and interfaith dialogue. And this is a rough paraphrase, but it's pretty close. He said something to the effect that the chasm between Islam and the infidel is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it except for the purpose of bringing the infidel to Islam. In other words, the real purpose of this bridge building business, no matter what our priests and rabbis and so on might say or think or believe, the real purpose, for the Brotherhood at least, is, again, proselytization, recruitment, conversion, indoctrination, and subversion. A very bad bit of business. And you could go through a couple of these other things. I'm going to talk at the end about this effort to insinuate Sharia into U.S. courts. But time being a little brief, and I do want to leave as much as possible for questions, I wanted to just quickly turn to the last of these items and discuss it in a little bit of detail. Getting Muslim Brotherhood operatives into government or other positions of authority from which they can exercise influence is really important to the brothers. So let me go to the next slide. You're all familiar with this gentleman. I want to just talk in the next slide very briefly about not all of these folks, just because in the shortness of time there isn't an opportunity to do justice to it. If you're interested, each of them is profiled in detail in that course that I mentioned, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. I mentioned just, I guess, in passing, the little lady up in the upper left-hand corner. You may know her as Mrs. Anthony Weiner, former member of Congress, former candidate for the mayor of New York, rather disreputable character. His wife is also known as Huma Abedin. She's been very closely linked, both personally and through her family, to the Muslim Brotherhood for decades. And yet she was serving until recently as the Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Department of State under Hillary Clinton. She's still very close to Mrs. Clinton and worked for her before their time at the State Department and will in the future if Hillary goes on to anything else. I want to focus, though, on the man in the middle of the lower tier. If we can go to the next slide, I'll introduce you to him. His name is Mohammed Elibiari. He's actually something of a homeboy for you all. He hails from Plano, Texas these days, where he has an organization he calls the Freedom and Justice Foundation. Interestingly, if that sounds familiar, Freedom and Justice was the name given to the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Egypt when Mohammed Morsi ran for office and won. There's a lot I could tell you about Elibiari, and I won't get into a great deal of detail, but this is illustrative. He was an apologist for Anwar al-Awlaki, who you may remember was for quite some time an imam here in the Washington, D.C. area, host to several members of the 9/11 hit team, and influential with a bunch of others, notably the shooter at Fort Hood, Nidal Hassan. He was whacked by the United States government running al-Qaeda operations in Yemen last year. Let me go to the next slide, please. Because of Elibiari's ability to reach out to the Muslim community, and despite these rather troubling sympathies, which are matter of public record for bad actors, including al-Awlaki and, for that matter, the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic. He was given a position as an advisor to the Department of Public Safety. I'm happy to report that they subsequently cashiered him. But if you go to the next slide, by virtue of that role in DPS, he managed to get himself onto the advisory committee for the federal Department of Homeland Security. The man standing next to him, by the way, is Bill Bratton, who is now the Commissioner of Police in New York City. Next slide. Just very quickly, I want to give you some insights into how Mohammed Elibiari has conducted himself as an advisor to the Department of Department of Homeland Security. As you see here, shortly after he got a security clearance, because he was on that advisory committee, he began abusing it, next slide, for the purpose, we discovered, of trying to portray your governor as an Islamophobe at a time when he was running for President of the United States. But much more important, next slide, was what Elibiari succeeded in doing, starting on an occasion in September of 2011, when the then director of the FBI decided to give him the Bureau's highest civilian award for his extraordinary contributions to specific cases and his efforts to help with Muslim outreach for the Bureau in the Texas community, a Muslim American community. Next slide. This award was presented at the FBI's Training Academy in Quantico, where there is a Training Academy library. And let me go through these next couple of slides very quickly. 6 days after Elibiari was at the FBI Training Academy in its library, a series of screeds began appearing under the byline of a fellow by the name of Spencer Ackerman, who's a very radical leftist who writes for Wired magazine, vilifying the FBI's Countering Violent Extremism training program. And you might wonder, what is countering violent extremism? Well, that's a euphemism, of course. It's the euphemism that is currently used by the Obama administration in lieu of the previous euphemism used by the Bush administration, which was terrorism. Both are about, actually, jihad. though the further you get away from describing it, the easier it is to say that the problem really isn't the jihadists, it's, oh, I don't know, people who embrace the US Constitution, or are Tea Party activists, or anti-abortion activists, or something else. But the point of this is, if you go to the next slide, please, on the 18th of September, LABRE sent a very fawning thank you to a mash note, if you will, to Ackerman at a website called Muslim Matters. Next slide. And on the 23rd of that same month, there was another of these screens from Ackerman that this time was accompanied by photographs taken on a cell phone in the FBI training academy, showing some of the so-called Islamophobic materials that were observed there. Next slide. On the 4th of October, Mohammed El-Biari and a bunch of his friends, including the American Civil Liberties Union, wrote FBI Director Mueller demanding, on the basis of these various Ackerman articles, that the United States Federal Bureau of Investigations purge its training materials of this kind of offensive material and documentation. On the 19th of that month, next slide please, 57 of these groups, both on the hard left and among the Muslim Brotherhood fronts, including Mohammed El-Biari's own Freedom and Justice Institute, wrote to John Brennan, who at the time was the Homeland Security Advisor to the President, demanding that not just the FBI's training materials, but all of the other agencies of the government that have that kind of material, that kind of training, that kind of need to know, also be purged. The Defense Department, the intelligence community's various agencies, the Department of Homeland Security itself, all need to be cleansed of this kind of offensive material to Muslims. Next slide. On November 11th, John Brennan agreed to have all such material removed. He has subsequently been appointed to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, where he is overseeing this kind of information-free training and practice. Next slide, your own Louis Gohmert, one of the most admired members of Congress, as far as I'm concerned, queried the then Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security about what was going on with all of this. What was El-Biari doing, and why was he being allowed to get away with using classified material to attack the governor of your state? What was he doing getting into this purge of sensitive but necessary information for those who are supposed to protect us? He was assured by Mrs. Napolitano that she would be getting back to him, but as far as I know, she never did. Next slide. I just want to very quickly, and I know I'm probably over time here and taxing your attention, but let me very quickly give you a couple of other examples of what's going on in your own state with respect to problems that reflect the penetration of these jihadists, these civilization jihadists in some cases, in other cases the old-fashioned kind, in the state of Texas itself. Next slide. I think I mentioned that that explanatory memorandum, if I didn't, I should have, was made available to all of us because it was introduced into evidence in the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, which took place not far from New Orleans, Dallas, the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2008. The folks on the upper right are the 5 co-conspirators who were prosecuted and successfully convicted for having provided some $12 million to this terrorist group, Hamas. Next slide. I just want to drill down for a moment on the fellow on the far right, Mufid Abdul Qadir. Mufid Abdul Qadir was described in the trial as one of the most successful of the five. Next slide. That is in part because he was a rock star. He would go around the Hamas fundraising circuit singing jihadist songs to audiences and getting them to open their wallets to give money in the form of material support for this designated terrorist organization. You see there an example of the kind of glorifying of suicide bombers that he did in his heyday. Next slide. One other interesting data point about Mufid Abdul Qadir is he is the half-brother of the guy on the right, who you may remember is the fellow who runs the designated terrorist organization, Hamas. The other thing, next slide, that should be of particular concern, I think, to all of you there in Texas, is that for 8 years, he was an engineer on the payroll of the city of Dallas. And he was described by the then FBI special agent in charge as a fellow that the mayor at the time of Dallas ought to be concerned about, because he had access to detailed technical plans pertaining to the city's infrastructure, unquote. That's not the kind of thing that you would want in the hands of a Hamas sponsor and material supporter. And yet the mayor of the city did nothing about it at the time. Just very quickly, in the next slide, you'll see some 59 mosques. I think this is actually probably out of date. I believe there are more now, just in the Dallas area alone. Again, I hasten to add, not all mosques, any more than all Muslims, are a problem. It's just that many of them are, by an estimate done on the basis of an undercover investigation that a colleague of mine did a couple of years ago, of 100 mosques across the United States, looking for evidence that they were promoting Sharia and jihad. He discovered that basically wherever you found them promoting Sharia, they were promoting jihad. And roughly 80 of the 100 mosques that were investigated had evidence of both. Specifically, those that describe themselves as Islamic societies. I don't know if you've got one in Tyler, but you probably do. If you don't, you will in due course. Or maybe an Islamic center of Tyler. Those are Muslim Brotherhood operations. Full stop. Typically, their mortgages are held by something called the North American Islamic Trust, which is one of the groups that was on that list I showed you in the attachment to the explanatory memorandum. This is a Saudi government underwritten Muslim Brotherhood front whose purpose is to buy or initiate mortgages for mosques. And with that kind of ownership, of course, comes a great deal of say over who's the imam for the mosque, what's taught in the madrasas, the schools that are associated with the mosque or the Islamic Center, what's in the bookstores or in the library, way of videos or books of various kinds. In other words, it assures that you're able to control the use made of the mosque if you own the mortgage. And when the Saudi government does, through this North American Islamic Trust, you can bet that it's about as bad as it can get. Next slide, please. I mentioned Nidal Hassan earlier, man, of course, charged with workplace violence. Another of those dots that you just got to scratch your head and wonder what's that about. Of course, what he was doing with the influence of Anwar al-Awlaki is jihad, pure and simple. He said as much. When he shouted Allahu Akbar, when he shot 13 of his comrades and a baby in utero, he was about jihad. And in fact, he made it abundantly clear before he engaged in that act that he was going to do it, which makes all the more a travesty that he was not stopped, let alone that he was prosecuted for workplace violence. Next slide. I don't know if these photographs are familiar to you, but in Dallas, not so long ago, I think it was Dallas, maybe it was Houston, I'm not quite sure where, but in Texas in any event, this Egyptian-born fellow, Yasser Said, engaged in the practice, also embraced by Sharia, of honor killing. He murdered his 2 daughters because they were wearing blue jeans and makeup and dating American boys. This happens in America. This is not the only incident, it just happens to be one that took place in Texas. Next slide. This is a fellow who I mentioned, I think, among other things, Mohammed El-Biari's involvement with the Brotherhood is evidenced by his attesting, as you see in that last bullet, to this fellow Ghassan Hito's high standing with the Muslim Brotherhood at the time that he was being recruited by the Obama administration and installed as the first so-called prime minister of the opposition interim coalition. He didn't last long because you basically have the operation now run by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Islamic State. But it is interesting that this guy hailed from Dallas as a technology executive, but also as a leader of one of the most prominent of the Muslim Brotherhood fronts in the United States, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, or CARE. Okay, I'm nearing the end here. Thank you for your patience. Next slide, if I could, please. This fellow, again, the classic kind of jihadist, the violent kind, tried to blow up a skyscraper in Dallas in 2009. Next slide. This guy, Wissam Alous, was arrested in San Antonio in 2013. He's believed to have been seeking a high government position, or at least a sensitive one, from which he could wage war on behalf of another of these Islamist groups, Hezbollah. Next slide. Lastly, in this series, I just wanted to share with you, you may be aware of this fellow, or at least his charter schools, of which at last count you have, I think, actually over 40. They call themselves Harmony Schools. They operate on the government dime, but they are basically Turkish supremacist versions of the Muslim Brotherhood penetration of the educational system of this country. They're not so brazen as to talk openly about Sharia or about its program, but they sort of mask it in a patina of Turkish, as I say, supremacism. This fellow, Fethullah Gulen, hails from Turkey, though he currently operates a multi-billion-dollar empire of charter schools and other businesses from, as I say, they're an armed camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. This is an operation that bears watching, folks, and if you haven't come across it before now, I would commend that you take a hard look at the Gulen movement, the Gulen schools. There's information about it at our website, securefreedom.org. Again, just to come back to the 6 on this next slide, these are people who have, in fact, executed the civilization jihadist program of gaining positions of sensitive influential access to senior government officials. And I just wanted to tell you, I think this is a very troubling cast of characters, and if you want, again, to know more about it, check it out at MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com. Next slide. With their influence, and this is probably a busy chart that you can't read particularly well, and I apologize for that, but it just gives you some illustrative examples of the kind of impact these people are having in our government today. The policies that are being adopted by the Obama administration that, in fact, align more and more and more with the dictates or desires of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's worrying, to say the least, and what's playing out as we speak in the Gaza Strip is a particularly prime example of this, where
You had the U.S. government, not only, as I mentioned earlier, giving $47 million of your tax dollars to this designated terrorist organization, Hamas, in the guise of humanitarian aid. You had the U.S. government shutting down the only international airport of any consequence in Israel, with huge impact on tourism and on commerce and on the lives of Israeli citizens, emboldening Hamas, needless to say. And not least, you have John Kerry there, as we speak, trying to broker a ceasefire to protect Hamas from the destruction that I pray personally the Israelis will mete out. So this is an ongoing problem. It's not past history, and it's happening, I believe, in part because of the successful penetration of the U.S. government by these Muslim Brotherhood folks. This was of sufficient concern, next slide, back in the summer of 2012, for these 5 individuals, again, your own Louis Gohmert, of course, Michelle Bachmann, Congressman Trent Franks from Arizona, in the upper right, Congressman Lynn Westmoreland in the lower left, and Congressman Tom Rooney in the lower right. They came together in what Newt Gingrich saluted them for being the National Security Five. And they wrote, next slide, letters to the inspectors general of these 5 agencies, based, frankly, in part on the course that I've mentioned, MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com, which pointed out that these agencies have people with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood serving as advisors or serving as actual officials of these agencies. And these letters, which you can find if you want to take a look at them at Michelle Bachmann's website, very respectful, tailored to each of the agencies and making the point that you have such and such a person, in the case of, for example, the State Department, Homa Abedin, in a senior and influential position, and you have these kinds of policies being promulgated. Inspector General, would you look into whether there might be a connection between those 2 facts? Well, as you may know, Michelle Bachmann was savagely attacked. It's the only way I can use to describe it. Most notably by John McCain, senator from Arizona, on the floor of the United States Senate, for having impugned Homa Abedin. I don't believe John McCain ever read the letter that was written about her. I'm sure he was not familiar with the substance behind it. But he nonetheless flayed Michelle Bachmann. I think it's no exaggeration to say that he almost cost her re-election last time. And I believe it had something to do with her decision to not run for re-election this year, that she had been so badly bruised by John McCain. And by the way, John Boehner, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Mike Rogers, the House Intelligence Committee, and a few others. All of her own party. The point being that Michelle Bachmann was absolutely right, as was Louis Gohmert, Trent Franks, and the rest. To her great credit, I do want to say, just yesterday, Michelle Bachmann introduced into the House of Representatives legislation that would designate the Muslim Brotherhood officially what it is in fact, namely a foreign terrorist organization. This is a piece of legislation that get behind. It's H.R. 5194, just introduced last night. Let me just go to the, that was actually the subject of the next slide. I don't know exactly where you are, but hopefully that's, that you caught that. Next slide. In addition to supporting H.R. 5194, there are some other things that you can do as individuals, as members of a group. Act for America, for example, is a terrific one. The Tea Parties could be as well. Or as citizens of this country coming together to try to address a serious national threat. Let me just give you one example. The 10th part of the course that I've referred to now several times, MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com, is all about what you can do in each of those capacities. But I just want to focus in the last slide on one that I want particularly to commend your attention, and that is the effort that we've been making around the country to see if we can keep Sharia out of American courts. And the way we've undertaken to do that is to have what we call American laws for American courts as the policy of various states. 7 of them have adopted this legislation. An 8th is going to, I think, in November. Others have it under consideration. We have tried twice now in the state legislature of Texas to have it adopted. And each time, despite what seems to be overwhelming support for it, in the dark of night, at the last minute of the session, somehow it always seems to come a cropper. And so if you're interested in this, one of my colleagues, a fellow named Tommy Waller, a combat Marine, extraordinary human being, is anxious to help you and work with your representatives in the state legislature to make it the policy of the state of Texas that only American laws will apply, not foreign laws. Sharia is not singled out, by the way. It's just one of a number of foreign laws that are at odds with our Constitution that should not be used in our courts, though increasingly they are, unfortunately. We've done a couple of studies. We've got one that's already published and others in the works that document the extent to which American courts have in fact had Sharia law introduced and used to adjudicate some matters, including many family law cases. So let me just conclude with this last slide. I hope I've helped you connect the dots between these various otherwise perhaps inexplicable things that have been happening on the part of our government. Policies, events, statements, conduct. I hope in particular that you see that what they all have in common pretty much is this connective tissue of Sharia, a threat truly of a global character, not just to us, not just to Israel, not just to Europe, but worldwide. I hope I've conveyed the importance of the Muslim Brotherhood in bringing that threat to a theater near you. That the way they're doing it through stealthy means has enabled them to succeed probably beyond their wildest expectations to a point where we're still not even aware that it's happening, amazingly enough. I believe that Michelle Bachmann is exactly right, that this is the moment. It's really past due, but certainly we shouldn't allow this threat from the Muslim Brotherhood abroad and here to continue to metastasize. It needs to be challenged, it needs to be called what it is, and we need to stop doing what the Obama administration has done again, again, and again. In part thanks to the people who penetrated it, I think, namely legitimating, embracing, funding, and even arming the Muslim Brotherhood. And finally, your help is urgently needed to both help explain to our fellow citizens what we're up against, help them and the rest of us, especially your elected representatives, come to grips with these threats, and hopefully do it in time to prevent what I think is happening as we see day in and day out, not just in the Middle East and other parts of the world, but in Europe at the moment. Namely, the rise and increasing dominance of Sharia and adherent Muslims and the bending to their will of the rest of us. We mustn't let it happen here. I'll conclude, if I may, by just saying that my old boss, Ronald Reagan, had a very important message back in 1961. He said it subsequently a few times, but I'll just leave it with you as a kind of parting thought. He said, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation removed from extinction. We don't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for. It must be protected. It must be passed on to them to do the same. Or we'll spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States when men were free. I think we gathered today, to ensure that that isn't something that will befall our children or that we will have to explain to them because of our inaction. And I'm happy to take your questions and otherwise make common cause with you to these ends if I can. Thank you.
For being here. Can everyone hear me out there? Okay. The first question is, do we have an estimate of the number of jihadist Muslims or Sharia Muslims that have crossed our own border recently?
I don't think anybody does have a good answer to that question. As you all know, because you're at the pointy end of the spear, if you will, in terms of this problem of border insecurity. The number of people that we apprehend and therefore have some sense of who they are, where they come from, and the like, is a fraction of the number of people who actually get across the border without being apprehended. Of the ones that we have caught, I've seen different estimates, and I don't honestly know which is correct. But my impression is that a very substantial proportion of those that are now coming across particularly are not only what they call other than Mexicans, they're other than hemispheric citizens. They're not from Guatemala, they're not from Ecuador, they're not from Honduras. They're people who have come, in some cases, from the Middle East or from Afghanistan or from places in Africa like Somalia or West Africa. You may have noticed, among other things, they have an Ebola breakout at the moment. There are also people, by the way, just to complicate things further, who have been converted to Islam who are from ISIS. And when I say converted to Islam, I mean not, benign kinds of Islam. I mean the Sharia adherent kind. Because people like Hamas and Hezbollah have inculcated this kind of indoctrination and bringing them to effect. Those are the people that I particularly found their heart to trust. I am indeed.
Next question is, do you believe the open border practiced by the Obama administration is intended to aid the Muslims in infiltrating the United States?
That's a good question. I have the feeling that it is more generally intended to help those who will come here. And I was listening to Mark Davis this morning on Bill Bennett's show, as a matter of fact. I'm sure you all know Mark from Dallas. He guest hosts for Bill on the Salem Network on Fridays. And he had a great riff today about the larger objective of the administration, with which I fully concur. And that is, he believes it's really about bringing in more members of an underclass. People who will be particularly receptive to the kind of, social services that the Democrats and the left often make a sort of staple of their politics, that they will be people who will vote Democratic in turn. They will be people who will help adulterate further, or if you will, fundamentally transform this country. Now, is it the administration's purpose, or are they, mindful even that among those that are coming in this fashion are Islamists? I don't know. But I will tell you this, what they're doing to let in, I mentioned this earlier in one of the dots that I cited, what they're doing to let in legally Islamists including people who have engaged in, quote, limited material support for terrorism, unquote. People who have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, or even, in some cases, even more extreme groups. I don't know if his name rings a bell, but Omar Abdul Rahman is the blind sheikh who tried to blow up the World Trade Center the first time in 1993. Members of his terrorist group have been brought not only into the United States, they were brought into the White House by the Obama administration. Apparently, we don't know this for sure, but I think this was certainly the purpose of the individuals coming in from Egypt. The purpose was to try to get the blind sheikh sprung from his life sentence in U.S. prison. So if they're willing to do that through the front door, it's not a stretch to believe that they wouldn't be terribly troubled about what would be coming in through the back door.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question pertains more to Europe, but is the Sharia Muslim invasion of Western Europe by immigration reversible by the alarm of the population? And do you think that the U.S. political parties are currently aware or alarmed by the events in Europe?
Well, that too is a great question. I think that things are approaching a really critical pass in Europe. As I said earlier, if you want to see where this leads, this trajectory leads a country like the United States, look no further than what's happening in France, for example, at the moment. You not only have rioting going on, where people are torching cars and buildings and businesses and so on in solidarity with Hamas on the streets of Paris as we speak. You have something on the order of 750 so-called no-go zones in France. No-go zones are areas that are effectively Muslim only. They're governed effectively by Sharia law. You don't have law enforcement. You don't have fire personnel. You don't have medical or tax collectors from the central government operating there. They're too frightened. In Britain, you have some of those areas beginning to develop, but you also have something else, going back to the point about the courts. You have 87 Sharia law courts formally recognized and operating side by side with English common law courts. Again, part of institutionalizing Sharia in Britain. And to go to your question, I think that there is a growing, not just unease, but expressed anxiety on the part of an awful lot of people who are, natives of Europe, shall we say, about what's happened as a result of this kind of open immigration influx and the increasing domination of the Muslims who have particularly taken advantage of it by Sharia adherent organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and worse. And the result is that I think we're reaching, as I say, a point at which you're going to see probably, as we have throughout Europe's history, a violent response. Maybe it can be managed in some fashion short of that, I hope it can, but expelling people who are trying to take down the governments of Europe, who are trying to fundamentally transform it into an Islamic caliphate, short of violence is not entirely clear to me how they'll do it or if they have the will to do it. I have the feeling that it will erupt at some point when, I don't know, somebody like a British soldier is massacred, butchered on the streets of London, and people decide they're not going to take this anymore. Now that actually happened. It didn't precipitate that result, but I think people are getting closer and closer to the breaking point.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us today. That's all the questions we have time for, but I will say you weren't able to hear it, but there was a lot of applause throughout your speech. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ernie Clark. You won't be able to hear him, but I'm going to say.
Let's all give Mr. Gaffney a great hand. What a great presentation.